Hey everybody, welcome to my new series, Demystifying the Real Estate Offer. And today we're going to start with video 1, which is going to be what is in an offer. And I'm just going to pull up an offer that I've written for a client on the screen, and I'm going to go through page by page and just say, what's in it? I think it'll be helpful to do that first so that we can see why it's important to plan ahead, start working on some of the components that are going to go into the offer before you get to the place where you see a house and you're like, oh, I love this house, I want to write an offer on it. Because then it's crunch time, especially if there's an offer deadline or they already have an offer and you're rushing to get something in. So what goes in the offer first? Literally in the beginning of the PDF, the first things that I put in are the finance information. So that's if you're getting a mortgage, a pre-approval letter from the lender that you have. If there's a letter, sometimes there's a cover sheet from the lender to the listing agent or the seller. Both of those I would put up front. If you're sending a copy of the earnest money deposit, that would go up there too. If you're filling out a financial information sheet, that would go there as well. The financial information sheet, it's not a required form, but sometimes you'll see listing agents and sellers request it. I don't want to go too far into the weeds on things like that form, but just note that there are some forms like that I consider to kind of all be part of those financial documents. And so for the ease of the listing agent reading them, I like to clump them all together in the PDF. Another thing that could go here would be proof of funds. I think this is especially important if the cash amount for your down payment and closing costs is high, or you are going to put, let's say, extra down payment, like I'm going to put 40% down because I just sold my house and I'm downsizing. You really want to show proof of funds. So that would be a statement from an account where that money is. And you can just obviously Sharpie out your account number, but just as a proof to say, see, I have the cash needed to close. All right, so what's next? The actual offer paperwork. I'm going to assume that we're purchasing in either DC or Montgomery County, and I'm using the G-Car sales contract. There's two contracts you can use in Maryland, the MAR and the G-Car. And so if you're in Montgomery County or DC, most people are using G-Car, whereas if you're outside of Montgomery County, you're purchasing in PG County, for instance, you'd use the MAR. It's a different contract, so it'll feel different in order here as we're going through them, but I'm just going to use the G-Car as a sample. Either way, the types of information you're going to need are going to be the same in both. They're just going to be laid out differently. Obviously, the beginning of an offer starts with who you are, who they are, and what the house is. And then obviously the next section is what is the price that you're offering and how is that broken down in terms of the down payment percentage, the first trust or the second trust, the total financing percentage, and like I said, the total sales price. So this is going to be just giving a breakdown in summary of how you're going to structure your loan. So for instance, let's say you're putting 10% down. You might have 90% on a first trust, which is the mortgage. But if there's a specific reason that you and your lender are structuring it differently, you might have, say, 10% down, 10% on a second trust, and the additional 80 on your first trust. That might be because you are planning to pay off a second trust sort of sooner than you were planning to pay off the first trust because of whatever your financial situation is, that makes most sense between you and your lender. So that's going to be where you summarize what that is. And then also, if it is financing, are you obtaining a fixed, conventional, FHA, VA, what kind of financing is it? That's summarized all right up ahead on the first page. The next section is going to talk about your deposit. This is your earnest money deposit. And that, we can go into, I guess, more later. I don't want to go too much into the strategy, but your earnest money deposit is literally a sign of your seriousness towards purchasing, because if you don't meet the obligations of you in the contract, this is what you're saying I would be willing to lose. And so the larger the amount is, the more that you're saying I'm going to follow the steps of this contract. That doesn't mean if you exit, you lose it. For instance, if you had a home inspection contingency and you had a certain amount of time in which to exit, if you chose to exit under those terms, you would still be able to get your money back. But it means I'm not just going to get cold feet and walk away. And if I do, here's $10,000. You're also going to know where that's being held. That's your title company. And a lot of times buyers don't have a particular title company in mind, and so they rely on their agent to give recommendations, which is fine. But obviously it's preferable if the buyer can at least take a look into those recommendations ahead of time. This is the company that's going to be insuring you against title defects. So it is nice if you have a chance to actually look through the websites of the title companies and make sure you're comfortable with the company that's moving forward. Later, when we get into talking about strategies, there are certain times where you might actually recommend going with the listing agent's preferred title company because it makes the listing agent feel more comfortable with the transaction. And when you're in a competition situation, it can be a slight edge. So there are even some strategies around that. But I would never want to do that at the expense of picking a bad title company. If there's a place that has really bad customer service, it might not be worth it to go through with that. You know, you still want to have a reputable title company. But again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on strategy at this point. The next thing that you're going to note is when you want to settle by and with whom, which is probably the same person that you put for who's going to hold the deposit. Typically, it's the title company for both. I don't really see brokerages holding it as much. And obviously, I think it's nice to have it held at a neutral party. But the settlement date, sometimes you have people say like, oh, well, I could probably settle by this date. And if not, we can just move it. Like, no, you cannot. This is your contract. This is what you have to do. So if you say, I'm going to settle in 30 days, it's 30 days. You don't get more. The only way you could get more is if you asked the other side, in this case, we're the buyer. So ask the listing side, the seller, do you mind if we get a little bit of extra time for closing? But you have to keep in mind that the faster the close, the better for them. So they're not really incentivized to want to do that. And you'd probably have to have a very good reason why you wanted it moved. So if you really want to be at the title company signing the documents because you want to have someone review it with you, then you need to make sure that that date is a date that you're actually going to be in town and can do it. Otherwise, you would need to get a power of attorney to have someone sign it or see if you can sign it ahead of time. It's a little bit tricky. You can't sign too far in advance because you need to have your mortgage finalized. So that's a good date to really think through and keep in mind. Another thing that you get to pick is whether or not you want to have a home warranty and who's paying for it, the buyer or the seller. So one of the things that you can do is say, all of the systems and the appliances in this house are really old, and I'm not sure how much life they have left in them. I'm going to spend all my cash buying this house, and I'm going to be a little strapped. So if something were to break sooner rather than later, I might not have the cash for it. So I'm going to go ahead and purchase a home warranty just to cover them. All right, so after that, there's the wood destroying insect inspection. This is not an area you're filling out. It's just a very important section that you might skip over since there's no checkboxes. But this is very important. This basically says that the buyer, at the buyer's expense, can do a wood destroying insect inspection, and that the seller is going to remediate or repair the damages that came from it. So this is a super important section because, well, for a lot of reasons, you should always do a wood destroying insect inspection because they're not that expensive to actually do. We're talking maybe $50. And it's going to outline whether or not there's been damage. So if you've had joists and structure destroyed by termites, you're saying that the seller is going to repair that damage, and that's obviously very important. So while there's nothing to fill out here, this is not a paragraph that you want to skip over. So then some of the other forms in here are forms, but paragraphs in here. The lead-based paint regulations, it's important to see them there. They're going to come up again when we get to the disclosures. We'll talk a little bit more about lead-based paint, but you're acknowledging what that section is. So if you have a house that's built before 78 that you're purchasing, lead-based paint becomes really important here, and so that section is something important to read. Then you go through what is a lot of legalese, if you will. How does title work? What about the possession date? What about broker's fees? What about what happens when there's a dispute? Legal expenses, what default is. That's when someone does not do what they're supposed to in the contract, and the contract, that person becomes in default. So this outlines what that looks like and how, say arbitration or something like that would work. And also we're looking at a lot of definitions, notices, delivery date. That's when we see that days mean calendar days, not business days. These things all become very important. So even though pages, I think it's like page two, at the end of 2, yeah, page 3 through 7 are mainly just things you need to have read. So once you've read them and understood them, you're kind of set on a lot of the contract. This sort of just outlines how that contract is going to work. So that wraps up the sales contract part of it. And then after that, you add in all of the addendums that you're going to need. So I'm going to kind of go through what some of those are so that you can see that when you're making your offer strategy, you're determining which addendums you're now going to add to the contract. So the first one that we're going to add here is the house we're going to say is in Montgomery County. So you have a Montgomery County jurisdictional addendum. And the first thing that you're going to look at is the master plan disclosures. So there are master plans for Montgomery County, and here it's or Rockville City. And when you sign, you're saying that you had the right to review these before you looked at the contract, before you close, that you have had the right to look at these master plans. These are very important. For instance, can you imagine if you bought a house before 200 was built and then they built 200 right through your backyard? That's something that was planned that you can see the route of. When the purple line came through, it was important to look at that route before it started construction. Now you can start to see in certain places where the stops are going to be, so you have a sense of where they're going to be at this point. But anything like that, like major changes in the planning and transportation and whatnot, it's very important to whether or not you're going to want to have your house in that location, and also just added value. For me, the purple line is a positive. I want to be near it. I don't want to be on top of it. I don't want to look at the station, but I want it to be a few blocks away. So when I purchased this house that I live in now, that was an important element of my decision making. I don't want to be too far away from that stop. So understanding those planning documents can be good. So if you're really focused on a certain neighborhood, go take a look at those master plans and see what's coming, see what's in them. One of the next sections is recordation taxes and transfer taxes. So the very first section says, is the buyer a first-time Maryland home buyer? Basically, yes or no. If you are not, then you state, this is how we want to split the taxes. And then it says, if you are a first-time home buyer, it says that you're agreeing that the amount of tax that the buyer pays actually decreases from 0.5% to 0.25% and is paid by the seller. And then it gives you an opportunity to say how the rest of the taxes are going to be split. A lot of times you see it being split equally, 50-50, but you can see different things. For instance, if you're getting a bank-owned property, it's pretty common that the bank wants the buyer to pay the transfer and recordation taxes for both sides of the transaction. So paying attention to that is important because we're talking about thousands of dollars here. And obviously the amount goes up with the value of the house that you're paying. Not the value, but the price, which are not the same thing. The price that you're paying, obviously the taxes, since their percentage, go up with the cost of the house. So this obviously can become a pretty crucial element. So it's important to make sure you know how the taxes are being split per the contract. Fun mid-video pause to tell the dog to go lay down. My cat is not helping. There they go again. So as soon as I got the dog to lay down, the cat runs by and then runs upstairs. And now he's meowing. Good times. All right, so one of the next sections in the Montgomery County Jurisdictional Addendum is it goes through the Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program and other Maryland-specific additions to the contract. So we have the non-resident sellers, the protection from Foreclosure Act notice. We've got property tax notice with the 60-day appeal, various other notices, how the release of deposit works, how the deposit is going to be kept, whether that's in a non-interest bearing or interest bearing account. So these are some specific things that, it's important to have read. There's not a lot that you actually complete. It's more just information for you to know. And you should definitely take a look through here. One of the ones, the Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program, as you know, there's going to be a lot about lead-based paint in this contract. And later when we get to disclosures, we're going to see the federal and the Maryland lead forms. But one of the things here is the Maryland Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. So typically what you'll see is if somebody has purchased a house and leased it, they were required to get a lead inspection if the building was built prior to 78, which is when the lead laws changed. And so when they had the inspection, they then take that information, register their house with the Maryland Department of the Environment, and that they're enrolled in this program. And so one of the ways that you know that a landlord's doing everything correctly is that they have done this and enrolled in this program. So it's required that they do so. So if they had been renting their house, they would have gone through these steps. One of the great things about this is that you can probably get some information on those lead inspections that they did and whether or not there were any concerns, which can save you having to do it yourself. All right, so as we said, you have the sales contract and then you add in addendums. The first one was Montgomery County Jurisdictional Addendum, which you have to add if you're buying a house in Montgomery County. And now here are some optional forms. So the first biggie is the addendum of clauses A. There's also a B version that has the less common additions, but let's look through a few of the more common additions. One of them is the seller credit. If you are asking the seller to provide you a credit at settlement for a dollar amount or a percentage, that would go here. So you would check off that box and you'd write down the amount and it would send over to the seller. And obviously as part of the negotiations, they either agree to it or it would be negotiated. The next biggie is the home inspection contingency. This one has a few different sections that become important. One is there a right to negotiate or just a right to cancel? A right to negotiate allows you to ask the seller for repairs or a credit towards their closing costs in lieu of repairs, or just a right to cancel, which is I found something really scary and I just want to exit. And so what you're going to do in this area is pick the number of days that you have to do the home inspection and negotiate it by that day. You have to start the negotiations by the end of the day that you've picked. So for instance, let's say it's a very competitive situation. You're like, I'm going to do it in 2 days. That doesn't mean that you get to then think about it, get all these extra contractors to come in and whatnot, and eventually get back to the seller. You have 2 days to do your home inspection, to bring in any contractors you want, and send over whatever it is you want to negotiate. So you have to be thoughtful about picking those days, especially if you want to be at the home inspection or if there's specific contractors you want to have. If a certain home inspector that you like isn't going to be available for 4 or 5 days, it's probably worth checking in with them and seeing if you can hold a slot in their time and say, look, I'm going to put in an offer. Can you hold this because I'm going to write in a 5-day contingency and I just want to make sure that you're going to be able to see it on day 4 so that I have time to negotiate if I need to. So there's some thoughtfulness around picking that date. And obviously we can get into strategy later, whether it's just a right to negotiate or a right to cancel or both. So the next most common one is the radon inspection contingency. A lot of people know that now Montgomery County requires the seller to provide the radon test. So if you, test results that is, if the seller provides the radon test results to you, but you don't have a contingency, they're just informing you of the situation. They're not required to do anything about it. If you want them, let's say neither party yet has done a radon test. Nobody has any idea how it's gonna shake out. They didn't provide it to you already. It's not in the disclosure packet. The test has not been done. Then you might say, well, we're gonna have a radon contingency. And that way, basically, if the radon test comes in too high, it outlines how the seller will fix it at the seller's expense prior to settlement. And so there's a whole section that you should read through if you're interested in the number of days that how that delivery process on notification works. And so that section is how you would help hold the seller accountable to repairing radon rather than just telling you about the radon results. All right, the next section in here is the appraisal contingency. This is where we outline how many days that you have to get an appraisal, and if the house does not appraise, you can negotiate the price. So that might mean you ask the seller to drop the price to the appraised price. You might meet in the middle. It just gives you it outlines how you would negotiate it if the appraisal comes in low, and that's something that you need to negotiate. If the appraisal comes in at or above value, obviously you don't need this, and so typically the buyer's agent will just inform the listing side, the house appraised, and we're moving forward. And you would just sort of continue on. But this is the section that allows you to negotiate it. If you're gonna have FHA or VA financing, you don't need this section because they have their own built-in appraisals, and those will be in the financing documents that go for those. This is really meant for a conventional loan where you're adding in whether or not you're going to negotiate the appraisal. In a competitive situation, you might remove this because you're willing to pay cash for any difference between the value of the house for the appraisal and the price you said you would pay. So if the house is worth $550, but you said you'd pay $600, you're saying, I'll pay that additional $50,000 in cash because it doesn't matter that the house didn't appraise. I want it anyway, and I'll just pay the difference in cash, so I don't need this contingency. So that is that's something else that will come into the strategy behind what you're doing in terms of a competitive offer or not. But this is where you would add it if you wanted it. And then there's a few other things in here about different. There's private well and septic, the licensee relationship disclosure. So let's say the buyer is a real estate agent or the seller is a real estate agent or something, you'd put in some kind of disclosure here just to outline that that's the case. There's also a blank box for additional provisions. So if there's something specific that you wanted that you don't really have a checkbox for up ahead, there's this blank spot where you can put something else in. So that ends what's in the addendum of clauses A, and that's a lot of the big guys that you'll typically see. There are some other ones. If you have a pool or something like that, that might be in addendum of clauses B, or you can't test the air conditioning because it's the dead of winter and you want to have an inspection later. There's some other addendums that you can add to a contract, but this section or this document has the majority of them. The next addendum that you would put, so you have like sales contract, the MOCO, jurisdictional, the addendum of clauses A, and now we're at conventional financing addendum. So this is where you outline what loan you're gonna get. I'm gonna obtain a first deed of trust for, let's say 90% of the sales price, amortized over 30 years at a fixed interest rate of X% a year or at market rate. And then how many days you have in the contract after ratification in which to get a conditional commitment of financing. And that section gives you the ability, let's say 2 weeks into the contract, you lose your job and the bank says, we're not gonna give you a mortgage because you don't have a job, you have no income. you can no longer afford the house, this would allow you to exit because you can't afford the house anymore through, no fault of your own. You went into it with good faith, but you cannot close anymore. And this allows you to exit at that point. It also protects your deposit. So this doesn't kick in because you just don't want to pay for the house anymore. This kicks in because you can't pay anymore. And so that might happen because underwriting took a look at the file and they did their audit, and there's some kind of issue there with verification of income, verification of your assets, your employment, your credit check. Something happened and it fell apart. And this is the out for that. I personally think everybody needs to have this out because it's not really realistic if you're getting a mortgage that you don't need this, because the vast majority of people can't purchase the house anyway. If you want to get a mortgage, it's typically because you have to, that you don't have, let's say the house is $550, you don't have the $550 in your bank account that you can just pay for it. Now, if you have a lot of money, you want to structure it as a mortgage for whatever your financial choice is, but you had the cash, then you wouldn't need this, because you could say, well, if the financing doesn't come through, I'll just pay cash. Then you wouldn't need it. All right, so this next section that you would add to your contract after the actual offer, plus all of the addendums that you want to add, is the disclosure packet. I'm going to go through what's in them very quickly, but for every listing that you're seriously considering before you write an offer, start looking at the disclosure packets for those houses. Like, I like this house, I don't want to write an offer, but I want to look at the disclosure packet. A lot of times the disclosures are online and you can just pull them down from, well, you can't, but your agent can pull it down for you and send it to you. And you should take a look through and see what's in them and how they're laid out, because this has a lot of really important information. So one of the first ones is the inclusions, exclusions disclosure. This outlines which things stay in the house: the appliances, the electronics, if you had a pool, a spa, a hot tub, some other additional item that's going to stay, a shed, solar panels. There would be some kind of note here about those things. So take a look through and see what's included and what isn't, because sometimes there's specific things like the dining room chandelier is something they really love and they plan on taking it with them, and they've said it's not going with. If that was something that was a factor for you, that would be something you'd want to talk about here. And it might be something that you say, I really want you to leave that chandelier. So that's one section you want to take a look at. The other here is the Maryland Residential Property Disclosure and Disclaimer Statement. Now here, people are either disclosing things or disclaiming them. If they're disclosing, they're filling out, it's like 3 pages worth of questions that says, does water stand on the property for more than 24 hours after a heavy rain? If it does, they check yes here. So this outlines what the seller knows about the property, and they're filling it in to the best of their knowledge and ability. Now, there are obviously some sections where they can click unknown because they just don't know. But if there's any issues, any what we call latent defects in the house, they need to be outlining them in here. If they don't want to complete it or they can't complete it, let's say because somebody passed away, you might not have to disclose any of these things because you couldn't. You wouldn't know anything about the property. But for the majority of sellers who are living in the house, they should be able to fill that out. But if they don't want to, they can disclaim. If they disclaim, they basically are saying, go look and do your own home inspection to find. I'm only going to tell you about any known latent defects. So if they had a latent defect that they knew about, say there's a crack in the foundation, they would have to disclose it right here. The next section is there's lead-based paints, there's a federal form, and there's a Maryland form. On the federal form, the seller is going to disclose whether or not they know about any lead-based paint and whether or not there's any reports available. So if before they had been in the Maryland lead program that we talked about before, they might have some reports to share with you. So that might be a section where you see, yes, here's some reports. And then this is where the buyer says, I've read about lead warnings, I've received the Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home brochure, and I'm deciding to either do a 10-day check for lead in the house, an inspection, or I'm going to waive it. So it's just 10 days, unlike the other contingencies where you pick the number of days. This is just 10 days where you can do your risk assessment, do your inspection, or you waive it. And then the Maryland form, where they say whether or not they're registered in the Maryland program and whether or not there's been any incidents. So they would outline that in that Maryland form. The next biggie is what we call the REA. It's Regulation, Easement, and Assessment, Disclosure, and Addendum. So this outlines all of the sort of additional little rules that might impact your property. Smoke detectors, whether it's a moderately priced dwelling unit, whether or not they're exempt from the radon tests results, how water and sewer comes to the house, whether or not there's a condo or an HOA. If there is, there's going to be an addendum for those. The condo disclosure or an HOA disclosure outlining what the fees cover and what the cost is. So then we've got deferred water and sewer. If there's a front foot fee, they put it there. Is it part of a protection area? Is it part of a development district? There is several sections where it outlines that you get to see the estimated property taxes and the current real property taxes, and that those forms have been attached. So those are sort of additional forms that come in addition to this because of this form. The other one is a utility form and the plat. So there should be a plat if the house is in a subdivision, and you can either say that you are waiving receipt of it, that you've acknowledged receipt of it, or it's a new lot, it's new construction, then it would be slightly different. Whether or not it's part of an agricultural reserve, whether there's ground rent, whether it's part of a historic district, Maryland forest conservation laws, and whether or not it's in a forest conservation easement. And then airports, they disclose where the airports are that might overlap, because some people say, I didn't realize that airplanes were going to fly over my house. Well, this has a circle with a radius around each of the different airports, so you can kind of see at first glance whether or not there might be some flight paths over you, and then you can go and take a look at it, because that would be obviously something you want to know because of noise or anything else. And then we'd move on, let's see, the notice to buyers and sellers of buyers' rights and sellers' obligations under the Maryland Single Family Residential Property Disclosure law. It's the longest title, so we just call it the notice too, because it's so long. Anyway, this is also, there's nothing to fill out in this form. It just outlines the rights on both sides, and just everybody acknowledges it. And so it'll just say what latent defects are. So before, when I was saying you can disclose or you can disclaim, but either way you have to say what a latent defect is, it outlines what those are. So structural systems, including roof, walls, floors, foundations, basements, plumbing, electrical, heating, air conditioning systems, etc. It kind of just goes through, if there's any information that the seller has actual knowledge of, these are the things that they would need to disclaim. And just sort of outlines what those laws are. So this is a good form to read ahead of time, because you want to understand what buyers and sellers are obligated to do in a contract. And this is one of the forms that tells you what things are, and is sort of like the other reason why it's really good to take a look at an offer before you actually write one, because you don't want to be rushed to be trying to read this at the same time that you're writing your last minute offer. So then let's see, what do I have in here? Taxes, plat, utilities, and then sometimes you'll see agents including the MLS listing and the tax records printed in here, just to sort of keep all of that information into the contract. It's not a required form in the contract, but it's helpful to include it because that information is obviously important. And so if there's something that's in there, it's good to have looked through the tax record on it or the listing itself, and just any notes or details that might be in there. So that's a lot. And this video is going to be really long when I edit it, and I apologize in advance, but I really wanted to kind of go through at some level of detail what all that is. And there are so many other forms that we didn't even talk about. For instance, you want to move into the property before you close, you need a form for that. Or you want to let the seller stay after closing for a period of time, you need a form for that. You want a home sale contingency because you want to go under contract, but you also want a chance to sell your other house. There are so many other things that might go into it, and they would all just get added. So it's quite a lot. That's why when an agent says we really should meet to talk about offers, to look at offer strategy, to pick some of these things, it's really good if you just do it, because all of a sudden you'll find a house, you'll be like, oh my God, this is it. I want to write an offer on this house. And you've got all of this to read, and you do not want to skip reading this contract. It is something that you should read. You're spending a lot of money. It has very specific implications about what you can and can't do, when you can exit, when you can't, whether or not you're going to lose money. And this is something that you are agreeing to. So you don't want to leave it till the last minute, have a short offer strategy meeting, write it and submit it because you're in a competitive situation and have not understood this. So that's a lot of times too why if you're in a competitive situation and you lose out on the first house, you're almost better prepared for the second time because you've gone through that offer process already. But why learn on that first house? Have a meeting, look at an offer, read through the paperwork, see what's there, start filling out those forms. Make sure your lender stuff's ready to go. Make sure that financial information sheet is ready to go if you need it, that your proof of funds is ready, that you know which title company that you're going to work with, that you know sort of when you can close, that you're kind of keeping an eye on your calendar and sort of freeing it for that. Whatever it is that you can be doing to start preparing, because you're going to have to fill out all of these forms. And when I say your agent's going to fill it out, but you should also be looking too to make sure that it outlines everything that you want, because once it's submitted, that's it. That's your contract. Everyone's agreed to, is obligated to follow it as it's written. And while yes, things do get added or changed or modified in some ways under contract, that's only with the agreement of both parties. It's not something where you can just say, I changed my mind on this, I want to do this differently. If that happens, you have to get the agreement of the other party. So this is something that you want to do. So I hope that I've now convinced you that the offer is quite complicated. And that's why I'm making an entire series where I'm going to go into everything else that is involved in this, because as you can see, it's not just filling out the forms. You have to do comps at some point to figure out what you think you should pay for this house. And then you have to say, well, what happens next? I filled out this offer. What happens next? How do I ratify? What does that mean? And then I want to start looking at when things go wrong and sort of pulling apart like the little addendums that we added. Start saying, well, what if something goes wrong in this one? What if something goes wrong in the home inspection, the radon, the appraisal, the financing, a pre-settlement or a post-settlement occupancy? And just saying, how does that affect everything? And hopefully by the end of this series, you'll see why it's so important to be clear with your offer strategy, to understand what it means, because if you give up the right to something and later you want it, you won't necessarily be able to get it back. So it's going to be very important to understand what it means, especially if you're waiving contingencies, how that impacts you and where you would go next. And so I hope that this super long, crazy initial video wasn't too much. I'm going to try to keep the next ones much more focused, whereas this one is just kind of like, oh my God, look at all of the things you have to fill out. It's so much. That's a little bit intentional, but the next videos aren't going to be like this. They're going to be much more focused. What can you do? What can't you do? And what is some strategy that you might want to think about around these? Because eventually all of these pieces build on top of each other to give you that one offer strategy. because that is going to be the difference sometimes between whether or not you're successful in coming to terms with the seller, whether it's a competitive situation or not. The seller and the buyer have to eventually get on the same page, otherwise you're never going to get to closing. And so understanding what you're asking of the seller when you ask for certain things is going to help you know whether or not you want to be doing that. So I hope that you've gotten through this video and that we will try again video 2, where I'm going to look at some of the things you need to be doing in order to get ready for writing an offer. So like, what's the checklist of things you should start doing? And then also, what do comps really mean? And what is an agent doing when they're running comps? So I hope that you'll stick with me for this series, Demystifying Real Estate Offers.